We're going to do something slightly different today. For the people who have handouts to share, I'm just going to upload them into the file window for you to download. The reason for that is we're trying to record this session, and it'll be better this way to have a nice big window of, of the main speaker. So without further ado then, I'd like to present David Pitt. David Pitt is professor at California State University in Los Angeles, and he's written numerous articles in the philosophy of mind, some papers on music, but back in the day, I believe.
One paper
on music. You have was it an MA in music theory, is that right?
Composition,
that's right. So you can ask him questions about composition as well, which he'll take after this phenomenology stuff. And he has a book. He's writing a manuscript that should be done very soon, and the title of that is
The Quality of Thought.
The Quality of Thought. So make sure to look out for that coming in the near future. And David's going to be talking today on a primer on cognitive phenomenology. All right, take it away.
Good morning. Thank you. And I'm very happy to be here. Unfortunately, I never got to meet John Teenson, but I had read his book with Terry on connectionism, which I learned a lot from. And I was heartened to see that when Terry and John's famous paper came out, I was heartened to see that there were others who were thinking along the same lines as I was, because one never knows whether one's a crackpot. And so it's nice to have some confirmation. So what I wanted to talk about today was the way I think about cognitive phenomenology, and the way I think maybe John and Terry, and definitely, well, at least in part, Galen thinks about it. So when I use the term in my 2004 paper, what I meant by cognitive phenomenology, and the subtitle, or the disjunctive, the second disjunct in the title, is what is it like to think that he. What I meant by cognitive phenomenology is the phenomenology of thinking, or the phenomenology of entertaining thoughts. Right? What is it like to think? So the basic question was, well, there's something that's like to hear, something that's like to see, et cetera, et cetera. Is there something that it's like think? And by thinking, I meant not a propositional attitude, not believing, not desiring, not doubting, but just entertaining a thought. And it's come to be used by many people, including Terry, to include things like a phenomenology of belief and desire. That was not my intention. I don't think that was Galen's intention when he talked in Mental Reality about understanding experience. And so I've adopted in my own work, instead of cognitive phenomenology, conceptual phenomenology or propositional phenomenology. But if you think that there's something it's like to think, in analogous to there being something it's like here, there remains a question of whether what it's like to think is I called proprietary, whether it's different from all the other modes of experience and the way that they differ from each other. So some people, like I think Jesse Prinz, think that, well, yeah, there is a phenomenology of thinking, but it's a phenomenology of hearing words in your head, maybe seeing words on a inner computer screen or something. But what I argued, and what I think Terry and John and Galen, and also, of course, historically Husserl, meant was, no, a kind of experience that's different from auditory experience, the experience of hearing words in your head, or visual experience. That is what I call a proprietary experience, an experience that's as different from hearing and seeing as they are from each other. And so what the focus of my work is really on the a proprietary phenomenology or kind of experience of pure thought that's not attached to any particular attitude. And I think the question of whether also there are also phenomenologies of the various attitudes, it's a separate question. It's an interesting question, and I'm kind of stuck on the fact that you can seem to yourself to believe that P when you actually don't. So an example I used that Michelle gave a talk a week or so ago was you could say, and you could actually believe that Black Lives Matter. And if someone says, "Do you think Black Lives Matter?" and you'd say, "Well, of course," but then it's revealed in your behavior that maybe you don't really believe that the way you act. So there's a possibility of discrepancy between what your conscious state is. It seems to you believe it, and your sort of functional behavioral state that suggests you don't really believe it. And so I wanted to, because I kind of got stuck on what to say about that, I sort of put belief aside to focus just on the phenomenology of thinking itself, and what I mean by cognitive phenomenology is just the phenomenology of thought or thought. So you can believe that there's a phenomenology of cognition without believing in a phenomenology of distinctive and proprietary kind of phenomenology, right? The phenomenology of cognitive phenomenology is just linguistic phenomenology, you might think. That's not what I think, and I don't think that's what Galen thinks. I don't think that's what Husserl thought, who can tell. I don't think that's what John and Terry meant, or Charles Seward. I should bring him into the discussion. So, I mean, that's a choice point. And if you choose the proprietary mode of experience branch, you can further ask the question what the relationship is of that kind of experience to the content of thought. And you could say, the way Charles Seward does, that, well, maybe it doesn't have a whole lot to do with the content of your thinking, content of your thought. Or you can go the route that I go, and I think Galen and John and Terry and Charles, and not Charles, of course, but Galen and John and Terry do, which is that this distinctive sort of phenomenology, this proprietary phenomenology, determines content. And then there's two ways you can there's another choice point here. You can wonder whether this phenomenology plays the role of expressing a content. So you've got, let's say the content is of a thought is a proposition. Proposition is a mind and language independent abstract object. And you could think of and if you're addressing the question of, well, how is it that a state of my brain or a state of my mind comes to have that as its content? And one way to think about that is that it's in virtue of this, having this kind of experience, that your mental state expresses the proposition. So in my own thinking about this, or rather my own thinking about this arose from, well, I was raised by Jerry Fodor, basically, and indirectly Fred Dretske. So the idea was, okay, well, you're in this state that has propositional content. Proposition is this abstract object. And so in virtue of what is it that your brain state or mind/brain state has that proposition as its content or expresses that proposition. And, Dretske had an idea, and that, that tracking relations, and there are other ideas about a conceptual role or a functional role. And I was thinking, well, I didn't like any of those. And so originally, actually, in my 2004 paper, I was thinking that it's in virtue of having this kind of a qualitative character that a thought and a current conscious thought expresses the proposition. You have the proposition, and then you have the phenomenological type, the cognitive phenomenological type, and you have an expression relation between them. That's one way to think about. If you think that cognitive phenomenology has something to do with content, that's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is that the cognitive phenomenology and the cognitive phenomenal types are contents, so that the relation between a thought content considered as an abstract object and a current thought is tokening of a type, more analogous to the way, say, a particular kind of pain experience is a token of a particular pain experience type. And that's the view I came to later. So you can ask, well, is there something it's like to think? And you can say, yes, there is. And then the next question is, okay, but is it distinctive? Is it proprietary? Is it different from all the other kinds of phenomenology? Yes and no. Okay, if you think there is this proprietary kind of phenomenology, what does it have to do with content? You can say, well, not much. Or you can say, well, it's somehow determinative of content, conceptual content. And then there's the other choice point there is that how does it determine? Is it determined by, is it an identity relation, or is it an expression relation between the phenomenology and the content? And then there's another important choice point here, which is whether you think this distinctive and proprietary kind of experience is just one kind of mental content. Whether you accept, say, a distinction between narrow and broad or wide content, and you cast conceptual or propositional or cognitive phenomenology in the role of narrow content, but you still think that mental states also have a wide or broad content. So this is along the lines of the distinction that was introduced by Putnam and then really developed by Fodor. I just lost my train of thought. So, right, there's the internal kind of content. Right. So the kind of distinction that was raised in response to the externalist thought experiments of Putnam, and Putnam, of course, as adapted by Burge and McGinn to apply to the contents of mental states and not just the meanings of words. So those Putnam-Burge experiments that say that social or natural environment can determine what it is that you're thinking. And so you could think that the role that cognitive phenomenology plays here is the role of narrow content, but there's still this other kind of mental content or thought content, which is wide content. And I think almost everybody who works in this, it's Terry and Galen and lots of other people think that there are these two kinds of content, and that phenomenology determines only one of them. The other side of that divide is people like me and Kadi Farkas, who say, no, really, there's only one kind of mental content, and that's internally determined, and it's this special kind of phenomenology, and the external stuff is all reference and truth values. So Kadi has a paper called Phenomenal Intentionality Without Compromise, in which she expresses this view. And I think that the narrow, wide distinction to begin with is unmotivated, because I don't think the thought experiments establish what they're supposed to establish at all. So I never bought the intuitions. And then, after 10 years, I have arguments against the intuitions. So, but that's another point in which you can say, okay, there is this cognitive phenomenology, and it does determine content, but it only determines the internal aspect of content. Or you can think, no, the internal aspect of mental thought content is all there is. So that's kind of a taxonomy of positions with respect to cognitive phenomenology, and right, whether there is such a thing, whether it's different from the other kinds of phenomenology, whether it is also a phenomenology of belief and desire and other attitudes, does it determine content and how it determines content, and whether it determines only one kind of content. So my own view is that it's a phenomenology of pure thought. It's a conceptual phenomenology, and that's all there is to mental content. There's also, of course, mental reference and mental truth conditions, but they're not the same thing. So maybe I'll stop there.
All right, thank you very much, David. All right, maybe we should pause just for a second for questions from grad students or professors who are maybe not familiar with this tradition. You just might have a couple of basic questions for David. Ed?
Hi, thank you very much.
Hi.
And nice to meet you. So it seemed like there were a couple of points in this taxonomy of that you referred to as choice points, and sort of, well, what's the relationship between the phenomenology of thought and content, for instance? Mm-hmm. And so it seems to me that in order to determine that relationship, you would need to provide a phenomenology of thought. Sort of what is it like? You would need an actual substantive account there. And so I wonder just what your thoughts are on what is the phenomenology of thought? What is thought like, such that it has some relationship to content or other?
Well, I would answer your question with a question. That is not really answer your question. But so what is the phenomenology of hearing, of auditory experience? Explain that to me.
I don't have a
yeah, me either, and I don't think anybody does.
But yeah, I don't want to. I think you would need an account of that in order to settle the proprietary claim as well.
Right. So the claim is all right. So maybe this will help. So Jesse Prinz would say, no, the phenomenology of thinking that today is Saturday is just the phenomenology of running those words through your head, talking to yourself. Well, I don't think that can be it, because you can talk to yourself in a language you don't understand. Right. And my favorite example is my colleague Mark Balaguer. When his daughter Emily was about 4, he said to her, look, if anybody ever asks you where you're from, tell them that you live in the causal nexus. And so she would say that, right? And you can imagine her hearing the words in her head, but she wasn't thinking that she lived in the causal nexus. She doesn't know what the words mean. So this is where Galen's term of understanding experience is very helpful. So that would be an argument that it's not that, and it's certainly not the phenomenology of seeing words printed, because you can see words in a language you don't understand. So is that the kind of thing you were looking for?
I think part of the way, yeah. So that's the nice negative picture of that grounds the proprietary claim, for sure. Because I think that those are good reasons to distinguish these different forms of intentionality.
But if you say you ask me, well, what is it like to see orange? Mm-hmm. I would say, well, it's kind of like what it's like to see red and kind of like what it's like to see yellow, but different.
Mhm.
I mean, phenomenology is ineffable in that sense. It's not. You can't describe someone into an understanding of what it is, and so that's why in my 2004 paper, the second half of the paper, which was really not intended to be an argument. I don't know who possessed me when I wrote the abstract for the paper. It was supposed to be isolating this kind of phenomenology, so that some people say, okay, I see your argument, but what is it like? What is this experience? Well, there's all these kinds of cases, these phenomenal contrast cases that people work on, that Galen talked about in mental reality. Hearing with understanding and hearing without understanding. Now, I think they're not the best way to argue for the existence of this kind of phenomenology, but I do think they are a way to bring it to people's attention. So that's another way to try to, because I think it's a really sort of honest objection that many people have, that, well, I don't experience this, right? I call it the Humean objection. Well, I cast around in introspection. In my mind, I find, sights and sounds and tastes, but I don't find this kind of phenomenology.
Mhm.
And so my response is, well, yeah, you do. You're just not paying attention to it. I mean, I think there's definitely something needs to be said there about why it's not as obvious as, say, phenomenology of pain, where you could say, well, someone's, I don't understand this phenomenology of pain. Just stick them with a pin or twist their arm or something. And, that's what I mean. And so my cases of, the Buffalo sentence and the Garden Path sentences, supposed to be examples where you switch from understanding to not understanding. And there's a introspectively detectable phenomenal difference. I didn't mean that to be an argument for the existence of cognitive phenomenology, but just a presentation of it in a kind of isolated way where you would notice it maybe for the first time.
That's very useful. Thank you.
All right, great. Well, let's see. So I do want to try to stick on schedule.
Well, it's too late for that, David.
Oh, okay. Well, you're right. It is a little too late to that. But our next speaker is going to be Terry Horgan.